My friends, tonight I want to invite you to travel back with me a very long way, far beyond the empires we usually hear about in books, far beyond the stone statues worn down by wind and sand, beyond the city walls that once stood proud and then crumbled into dust. We are going back to a place that, in the most widely accepted telling of history, was where humanity first truly stepped into civilized life. A place where cities rose out of mud, where the first writing was pressed into damp clay tablets, where people learned how to live not only with their own families, but with tens of thousands of others under a shared order, under shared fear, under a shared belief that the chaos of the world could somehow be arranged into something lasting. If you are listening late at night, then all the better. This is the kind of story that should be heard slowly, as though an old man were sitting under a dim yellow lamp, speaking in a low, weathered voice, never rushing, as if every sentence had traveled through centuries before finally reaching you. And before we go further, I want you to picture something. Imagine a morning so distant that none of the nations familiar to us today yet existed. The sun has just risen over the flat horizon of the lowlands. A thin veil of mist still hangs over the reeds. Mud clings to the ankles of the first farmers. And far away, standing against the pale sky, is a block of mud brick rising from the earth. It is not yet monumental by the standards of later ages, but it is enough to signal something enormous. Human beings have decided to stay, not just for a season, not just long enough to pitch a shelter and move on, but to stay, to dig canals, to direct water, to build storehouses, to build temples, to divide labor, to remember, and slowly to create what we would one day call civilization. And if you really sit with that image, it becomes strange and marvelous, because for most of human existence before that, people had lived by a different rhythm, following prey, following the seasons, following wherever life seemed easier. But at this moment, in that land between two great rivers, people accepted a new burden to remain in one place and make that place livable. That change alone was enough to bend the course of human history. And that is why tonight, I am not simply telling you about a distant land. I want to tell you about the beginning of so many things that we still live with even now. The city, the law, taxation, records, government, collective memory, stories of kings, lessons about power, hunger, war, the longing to leave behind something greater than one lifetime. Somehow, the seeds of all of these things were already there, very early in that place. And before the first city walls rose out of mud, everything began with two dangerous rivers, and with human beings who were forced to learn how to live together. That land, which would later be known more familiarly as Mesopotamia, was not paradise. If you hear the phrase, the cradle of civilization, and imagine a gentle, generous land where grain sprang up almost effortlessly, then we need to correct that image. No, this was not a place where nature was endlessly kind. It was a place of difficulty. Southern Mesopotamia was low, hot, marshy, muddy, short on stone, short on timber, short on metal. The Tigris and Euphrates brought water and fertile silt, yes, but they also brought unpredictability. In some years, the flooding came just right. In others, it rose too violently, spilling over banks, shifting channels, washing away the labor of countless hands. In such a place, one family alone could not endure for very long. To survive, people had to cooperate. To grow barley, they needed irrigation. To build irrigation, they needed many hands. To bring many hands together without chaos, they needed agreements. And once those agreements were repeated season after season, they ceased to be temporary. They slowly became order. If someone asked me where civilization truly began, I would not say it began with a king, nor even entirely with a temple. I think it began with the moment human beings were forced to solve problems too large for any one person to solve alone. Which canal would carry the water? Which field would be irrigated first? Which embankment needed reinforcing? Which grain must be saved for the next season? Where the storehouse should stand? Who would guard it? Who would divide its contents? Those ordinary questions, repeated across generations, became the real foundations of civilization. You can imagine an evening in one of those early communities. The sun is weakening. Wind drifts off the water, carrying the smell of wet earth. A few men stand beside a canal, arguing about whether they should cut a new channel toward a fresh field. Women are grinding barley. Barefoot children run between goats and clay walls. None of them know that these little discussions are the things that will one day grow into law, into authority, into administration. They know only this: if they do not work together, they will not survive the next flood. And it was out of that quiet struggle with floodwater, fields, and harvests that the first villages of the South slowly appeared, like tiny living shoots of a much larger world. There was no morning when human beings awoke and announced, "Today we shall begin civilization." Everything came slowly, so slowly that the people living through it may never have realized that they stood at the threshold of a turning point. They only saw that the granary was fuller this year than last year, that the village had a few more houses, that some people no longer spent every hour in the fields, but could make pottery, weave cloth, shape tools, that some knew more about ritual than others, that some were trusted to guard the grain, that a few voices carried more weight when decisions had to be made, and that was already a major sign. A community where everyone does the same thing is still simple, but a community that begins dividing roles has already entered the path of complexity. Some farm, some herd animals, some make pottery, some weave, some keep account of the storehouse, some oversee rituals. Once life produces enough surplus, not everyone must directly grow food. And that matters enormously, because every great civilization requires that one condition: enough surplus grain to feed those who do other work. Hold on to that thought, because it lies deep in the bones of history. Before epics, before monuments, before written law, there had to be agricultural surplus. Without extra food after the community had fed itself, there would be no scribes, no priests, no specialized craftsmen, no administrators, no minds freed from constant survival in order to do more complex things. Civilization, at bottom, always stands on agriculture. In those early villages, religion also became central, but we should not understand religion there as some separate corner of life, the way we sometimes do today. In that ancient world, religion was not one part of life. It was the way people understood life altogether. It's rain and drought, birth and illness, flood and famine. All of it could be read as expressions of divine will. And so the places where people worshipped were not merely places for prayer. They slowly became the shared center of the community. The one who tended the temple did not merely know how to perform offerings. He knew what the community feared, what it lacked, what it longed for. He might remember more than others, organize labor for communal works, speak in a language that seemed closer to the gods. And so, very naturally, authority began to gather around such places. Then, when people no longer wanted merely to survive from season to season, but to anchor their order in something sacred, places like Eridu began to appear in memory as a holy beginning of civilization itself. For the Sumerians who came later, Eridu held a special meaning. It stood almost as a city of origins, ancient enough to blur into myth. Modern archaeology is cautious about the exact meaning of the first city, but Eridu carried immense symbolic weight in Mesopotamian imagination. And that alone tells us something important. When a civilization looks back and places one site in the role of sacred beginning, it means that place has become the root of its own understanding of itself. I love Eridu because their history and myth seem braided together, and perhaps that is the most natural condition for any age so distant. We cannot split everything cleanly apart the way we like to now. And early people trying to understand themselves had to tell stories about their own beginnings. They had to believe that the order they lived under had not emerged by accident. It had been granted, or sanctioned, or arranged according to some sacred pattern. Just as many later empires would do, these early societies needed to turn power and order into something more meaningful than the everyday concerns of food and labor. So when the earliest temples grew, they were not just places of incense, oil, and offerings. They were places where grain was stored, where goods were gathered, where labor was organized, where the eyes of the community turned as toward a shared center. Imagine a mud brick temple, still low and simple compared with later monuments. Inside, an altar, offerings, the smell of oil and smoke, the murmur of prayer. Outside, baskets of barley, animals brought for sacrifice, men and women both trusting and trembling. They believed the gods upheld the order of the world, and they feared that if they failed in their duties, that order might collapse. But it was only when Uruk rose from the plain that humanity truly stepped into a new age, a world where a community was no longer just a village, but a city. Uruk is one of those names that feels like a great gate in history, because here, in the 4th millennium BCE, urbanization became so powerful that later generations had to acknowledge that humanity had crossed into something new. These were no longer just enlarged villages. This was one of the world's earliest great cities, a completely different structure of life. Think about it. A village can still run largely on familiarity. Everyone knows whose house is whose field is where, whose goats belong to whom. But a city is different. Once a population becomes large enough, people cannot live only by personal memory and kinship ties. A city must function through rules, through division of labor, through shared systems, through organized authority. And that is where something profound happened. People began living as members of an entity larger than themselves, larger than family, larger than clan. Uruk had great temples, public works, workshops, storehouses, organized labor, evidence of exchange over long distances. Because southern Mesopotamia lacked so much good timber, stone, metal. To obtain those things, people had to travel far, had to trade, had to organize. And once trade stretches over distance, society needs another layer of complexity, trust, agreement, record-keeping, accountability. The most astonishing thing about Uruk, I think, is not only the ruins archaeologists have uncovered, it is that the human mind itself had changed there. A man of Uruk was no longer only his father's son, a member of his household. He was also a person of a city. That feeling seems ordinary to us now, but at the time it was a massive psychological invention. The city created a new kind of identity. Imagine a morning in Uruk. Shouts in the streets, pottery knocking together, footsteps on packed earth, herd animals being driven along, the smell of barley bread baking, thin smoke rising from many homes, and beyond them, large structures that tell everyone at a glance, something exists here beyond the scale of family life. There is a center of authority, a shared order, a place where the labor of countless people is being gathered into something greater than the sum of its parts. And when the city had grown too large for human memory, alone to keep track of grain, taxes, and offerings. Then a world-changing invention quietly emerged on damp clay tablets. Few inventions have looked so humble while carrying so much power as writing. At first, it was not born for poetry nor for philosophy. It arose from practical needs. How many sacks of barley entered the storehouse? How many animals were delivered? How many rations were issued to laborers? How many offerings were made? Once a society became large and complex enough, memory was no longer enough. And so, memory had to be moved outside the body and placed into matter. A scribe sits before a wet clay tablet, reed stylus in hand. He presses one mark, then another. At first, these simple signs may represent goods, quantities, names. But from that moment, an entirely new horizon opens, because from then on, what human beings know no longer has to die with them. It can remain. It can be read by someone else. It can survive one season, one life, one generation after another. Do you see how immense that is? Before writing, agreements, traditions, and collective memory all had to live inside the minds of the living. And minds forget. They distort. They embellish. Once something is written, it takes on a form more durable than memory. That is the revolution. From then on, states can grow larger. Economies can become more complex. Traditions can endure longer. Laws can become more stable. And deeper still, human beings learn for the first time how to leave their words behind for people not yet born. I love to imagine stacks of clay tablets in a cool room with thick mud brick walls. Outside, the sun is brutal. Work continues. People argue, carry, pray, trade. But in here, on clay, the world is being captured in signs. Not everything, of course, but whatever society has decided it must remember. And the very act of deciding what must be remembered is itself one of the marks of civilization. From that point forward, the city-states of Sumer grew not only in mud, brick, and labor, but in power, ambition, and increasingly visible rivalry between rising centers. Slowly, southern Mesopotamia was no longer defined by just one center. Many city-states had taken shape. Uruk, Ur, Lagash, Umma, Kish, Nippur, each with its own patron deity, temple, fields, ruling elite, storehouses, and ambitions, all alike in their shared civilizational foundation, yet each different in what it wanted to become. When we look at the Sumerian world, we see something deeply alive. It was not one unified nation from the beginning. It was a network of city-states, each one like a small universe. And that is what makes its history so vivid. Where there are many centers of power, there is competition. Competition over land, over water, over trade, over religious prestige, over political influence. Not always open war, sometimes quieter. A disputed field boundary, a canal redirected, a claim of superiority, a temple's prestige rising above another's. And in that world, water was power. Never forget that. Water did not merely irrigate fields. It decided hunger and abundance. It decided harvests. It decided whether a city could feed its people, its craftsmen, its soldiers. One canal diverted the wrong way could leave land barren. One broken levee could destroy an entire season's labor. So among the city-states, land and water were natural sources of tension. But behind those walls and temples, what truly made that civilization function was not grandeur itself, but farmland, canals, granaries, and the hands of ordinary people. This is where I want us to linger, because when people hear about the oldest civilization, they are easily drawn to kings and temples and symbols. But the true body of civilization is not there. It is out in the fields where farmers bend under the heat to cut barley. It is beside the canals where laborers scoop mud so the water can continue to flow. It is in the potter's workshop where hands shape clay into jars. It is in the storehouse where rations are counted. It is among the people whose names are not remembered. A society like Sumer functioned through agricultural surplus, organized labor, and systems of distribution. There were people at the top, kings, nobles, priests, administrators. There were scribes trained to read, write, and calculate. There were merchants traveling outward. There were specialized craftsmen. There were large numbers of farmers. There were people lower down, more dependent, more burdened. Together, they formed a structure. And it is that structure that is so astonishing, because once a society can assign thousands of people to different roles and still maintain continuity across generations, that is already a monumental achievement. It means human beings are no longer living only as scattered little groups. They have learned how to bind themselves into a network of duties, fears, beliefs, and shared needs greater than any one household. I often think a clay tablet recording rations for laborers is no less magnificent than a temple, because the temple shows us what society wanted to display, but the ration tablet shows us what society actually had to do in order to survive. And then, as in all civilizations, once land, water, and power were no longer enough for everyone, prosperity began to draw behind it the earliest wars recorded in history. War came earlier than many people imagine, and perhaps it was inevitable. Wherever there is organization, wealth, and territory, there will be conflict. Disputes between city-states like Lagash and Umma show us a world in which land and water were not simply resources but survival itself. From this, military power gradually came into sharper focus. A city needed soldiers. A city needed walls. A city needed the ability to gather people and goods in order to defend its interests. Imagine a morning before battle. Dawn has only just broken. Men stand in ranks, gripping spears and shields, looking out across a field that ought to be a place of sowing, but is about to become a place of blood. They are not fighting for glorious slogans of the kind later ages like to invent. They are fighting over where the canal will flow, over who gets to mark the boundary, over whether their city will continue to live. This is bitter but true. War is also a product of civilization. It requires organization, resources, authority, the power to mobilize. And in that sense, when war becomes more visible, we are also seeing a society become more complex. But we are also seeing the price of that complexity. The closer people live together, the more they have to fight over. And yet, strangely enough, in the midst of a world of rivalry, tribute, and walls, the people of this land still lifted their eyes to ask questions greater than victory, greater than power, greater even than a single human life. That is what makes the history of Sumer and Mesopotamia deeper than a story of mud, brick, and war. Because very early on, people there did not merely record goods or royal names. They also left behind stories, hymns, myths, and epics, and among them, none is more famous than the story of Gilgamesh. I have always felt that the Epic of Gilgamesh is like another gate into the ancient world, a gate leading from administration into the human heart. Gilgamesh is remembered as a great king of Uruk, strong, proud, ambitious. But what makes him immortal in literature is not only his power, it is his grief. When his companion Enkidu dies, Gilgamesh realizes a truth that no wall can defend a person from. We will die. And then the greatest journey begins. Not to conquer land, not to raise monuments, not to defeat another city, but to escape death itself, to seek immortality. Do you see? Even in one of the world's earliest civilizations, the deepest question is the same question humanity still asks today. If in the end everyone dies, then what is life for? What are we building for? Why struggle? Why want our names remembered? Gilgamesh sets out like a man unwilling to accept the limits of being human. But what he finds is not endless bodily life. What he finds is a harsher and truer kind of wisdom. Human beings are finite. And it is precisely because they are finite that what they build, love, and preserve carries meaning. The walls of Uruk will erode. Strength will fade. But the story of fear, grief, and the desire to be remembered can outlive stone. That, I think, is why the epic still touches us. Beneath the ancient name, Gilgamesh is not so different from us. He fears losing the one he loves. He fears being swallowed by oblivion. He wants to find something larger than his own body to cling to. And perhaps that is why every civilization builds monuments, erects inscriptions, writes histories, tells stories. We all want to resist forgetting, even though we know the struggle can never be fully won. But history did not stop with separate city-states, because from the north, a new power was rising, preparing to gather the whole land beneath a wider shadow. That is when the name of Sargon of Akkad enters history. What we know of him is part history and part legend, which is often the case with figures whose influence grows so immense that fact and mythology begin to blur. But the most important point is this. With Sargon and the Akkadian Empire, the Sumerian world of competing city-states faced a new model of power, no longer merely many rivals standing side by side. Now a larger authority sought to stand above them all. This was a profound political turning point, because from here the question was no longer only, which city is stronger than another, but can one authority govern a broad land of many cities, many peoples, many traditions? That is the logic of empire. And once that logic appears, the history of the region enters another phase. What is striking is that the conqueror could not rule from empty air. Akkad did not destroy everything and start from nothing. It stood on foundations laid by Sumer, writing, administration, storehouses, systems of production, trading networks, symbols of authority. Like so many empires after it, the newcomer could only grow powerful by taking over the tools already created by the people before it. Imagine the feeling in the Sumerian cities. Each had long been used to thinking of itself as a center. Now a larger shadow stretches across the whole region. There must have been fear, anger, resistance, submission, adaptation. The hands of scribes kept writing, but now for a broader political order. Storehouses kept functioning, but within a different structure of authority. Empire, if you look closely, is always an expansion of administration. It cannot live by force alone. It needs roads, tribute, tax collectors, messengers, a memory large enough not to dissolve into chaos. And this is where the foundational role of Sumer becomes even clearer. Without those mental and administrative tools, empire would be nothing but a passing storm. And yet, as history has shown again and again, the higher a great order rises, the more vulnerable it becomes when disaster, rebellion, and ambition arrive at once. No empire is immune to fragility. In truth, the larger and more complex it becomes, the easier it is to break when too many links fail together. In Akkad and the troubled eras that followed, this became painfully clear. Pressure from outside peoples, rebellions from within, climatic instability, drought, trade disruption. Ancient history rarely collapses for one reason only. More often, it cracks in several places at the same time, like a vessel already lined with fine fractures that finally shatters from one more blow. I often think that the more sophisticated a society becomes, the more it resembles a stringed instrument. When everything is tuned, it produces beautiful music. But if a few strings slacken, the whole melody goes crooked. A failed harvest is never just hunger. It can mean reduced tribute, emptier granaries, stalled building works, discontented troops, restless, subject regions. A broken trade route is never just less merchandise. It can mean shortages in places that depend on distant supplies. And from those shortages, new pressures ripple outward. Let us imagine an old scribe sitting in his archive room. He has lived through the years when empire seemed strong, when goods moved, orders were obeyed, everything, though heavy, appeared to remain under control. Now he sees fewer tablets recording shipments. He hears darker rumors from afar. Some places have not delivered tribute on time. Some resist commands. In some years, the waters have not come as hoped. He does not know he is witnessing what later people will call the collapse of an age, because those within an age almost never name it that way. But he can feel that something has shifted away from the old order. And yet the land between the rivers was never a place that yielded easily to death. And out of those very fractures, the Sumerians once again gathered the pieces of the past and built a brilliant revival. This was the period often called Ur III, associated with rulers such as Ur-Nammu, and with determined efforts to rebuild order in the south. What makes this era so striking is not only that power returned, but that people were rebuilding a world that had already been broken. A society that had passed through chaos now understood more sharply the value of administration. And so the bureaucratic machinery of this era became extraordinarily strong. If writing had first been born from the need to manage, then here we see that power in full form. Records, clay tablets, inventories, distribution lists, labor accounts, offerings, taxes, everything reveals human beings in trying to tighten the frame of order by writing and remembering more carefully. You might say this was one of the moments when Mesopotamian civilization most clearly expressed its belief that order could be defended through management. From here, the state was no longer just a king on a throne. The state existed in thousands of little actions. Who received what? Who delivered what? Who worked where? Who was responsible for which task? And that is where civilization becomes both magnificent and heavy. The better the machine functions, the more it requires human beings to submit to its many links. In this era, law also becomes something especially visible. Early legal texts, such as the laws associated with Ur-Nammu, show that society had gone very far in turning the ruler's will into something written down. Of course, we should not romanticize ancient law. It was not just by modern standards. It reflected a stratified world full of inequality. But the very idea that order must be written, that it must take on a more stable form than personal impulse, is a major civilizational step. There is something very modern in that, in the deepest sense. Every large society struggles with the same question. How do you keep power from being only the whim of the strongest person? The ancient answer was law, records, procedures, institutional memory. And the seeds of that answer were already there, very early, in this land. Then came a day when, even though the cities remained and texts continued to be copied, the spoken voice of the Sumerians in everyday life began to retreat into the background of history. This is one of the saddest moments in the life of any civilization, when its language is no longer the mother tongue of most of the living. Sumerian, once spoken in homes, fields, and marketplaces, was gradually overshadowed by Akkadian in daily speech. But the strange and beautiful thing is that it did not vanish all at once. It entered a second life. Imagine a child in a later age, growing up hearing mostly Akkadian. His mother calls him in Akkadian. Merchants bargain in Akkadian. Guards shout in Akkadian. But when he enters a scribble school, he is taught signs, compositions, vocabulary list, and ancient texts in Sumerian. So the language passes from being a flowing stream of ordinary life into something preserved in schools, in rituals, in learned tradition. That is the sign of a civilization that has become classical. It no longer dominates daily life as before, but it is treasured as a body of inheritance. People copy it, learn it, preserve it, use it in religion, education, and formal settings. A civilization, therefore, does not die simply because its kings are gone. It only truly dies when no one wants to learn it, copy it, or use it to understand the world. But a truly great civilization does not disappear simply because its living voice falls silent, because what Sumer laid down continued to live in Babylon, Assyria, and in the worlds that came after. Mesopotamian history did not end with Sumer. Babylon came, Assyria came, other dynasties, other military machines, other centers of power rose and fell. But the more closely we look, the more clearly we see one truth. They did not begin from zero. They inherited enormously from the Sumerian Mesopotamian foundations that came before them. Cuneiform writing remained in use for many centuries afterward. Administrative practice, ideas of urban life, the management of land and water, organized labor, divine kingship, collective memory through archives, literary tradition, myth, law, all of it carried the long shadow of those early centuries. Babylon had its own face, Assyria its own temperament, but beneath them remained the packed earth of an older history. We might put it this way: Sumer laid the foundations of a house. Those who came later added walls, gates, upper stories, decorations, new emblems above the roof, even enough changes that outsiders might think it was an entirely new building. But dig down, and the old foundation is still there. That is why to speak of the oldest civilization is not to tell a closed story. It is to tell the opening chapter of a long historical river in which the most basic patterns of civilized life were first tested, refined, and handed onward. Pause here for a moment and consider how extraordinary it is that things we now take for granted, the city, government administration, taxation, written law, archives, schools for officials, systems for distributing rations, stories of rulers who want their names remembered forever, already had recognizable early forms in that land. Of course, they were very different from ours in countless ways, but the mental framework was already there. And when we look back across that whole journey, we begin to understand that what survives after the fallen walls is not merely ruin, but the first footprint of civilization itself. Do you know what moves me most when I think of Sumer? Not only its great age, but its strange closeness. The people there worried about water, about harvest, about war, about order. They feared death. They wanted their names remembered. They believed the things they built would outlast them. They had the poor and the powerful, the exhausted and the proud, the forgotten and the celebrated. In other words, beneath all that ancient mud, there were human beings, not so very different from us in the deepest ways. We can imagine an evening in a Sumerian city. After a day of punishing heat, the warmth in the earth finally begins to ease. Inside mud brick houses, a simple meal is set out. Children chatter. Someone repairs a basket. A dog barks in the distance. Along the dirt path between homes, a few people are still talking. Perhaps about fields, about exchange prices, about some new order from the temple, about a sick relative, about canal cleaning to come. An old man sits in his doorway, watching darkness gather. He knows he has lived through many floods, many harvests, seen the young grow up and die, seen the city change. He may know nothing of what we call human history, yet he is living inside its opening chapter, And I think that is the best way to see this oldest civilization. Not as a cold museum, but as a world where real people once lived, breathed, feared, and hoped. Famous kings are only the surface. Beneath them is the nameless multitude who held the whole world up on their backs. A farmer bent over a barley field in scorching heat. A young woman carrying water from the canal. A potter patiently turning clay. A novice scribe trembling after pressing the wrong sign into wet clay. A priest standing still before an altar in the smell of oil and smoke. A soldier who has never gone far beyond his city, now standing in formation on disputed ground. A mother clutching her child after hearing that the river has risen too fast. They were the real heartbeat of civilization. That world was not beautiful in some perfect sense. It contained oppression, inequality, war, the heaviness of bureaucracy, the use of religion to justify power. But these were also among the prices early societies paid as they learned how to live in larger, more complex, longer-lasting forms. No dawn is entirely pure. The dawn of civilization was no exception. It brightened, yes, but it also cast very long shadows. And perhaps that is why the story is worth hearing all the way through. Because when we look at it, we see not only the earliest achievements, we also see the earliest problems. How power uses religion, how the state remembers people, how surplus is divided, whether law protects everyone equally, what the strong do with the machinery society has built. The early shapes of all these questions were already there as civilization first began to bloom, and strangely enough, we are still answering them now in our own ways. If you stood today at the ruins of places like Ur, Uruk, or Eridu, perhaps the first thing that would strike you would be silence. When crossing ground once crowded with footsteps, places where people once shouted, traded, prayed, recorded, and worked, now lying under open sky. Yet in that silence there is a weight. It reminds us that entire worlds can disappear from the surface and still continue living in the ideas they first set in motion. Whenever I think of that, I feel something difficult to describe. On one hand, it makes human beings seem small, because everything can be lost: walls, languages, dynasties, temples, even names. On the other hand, it reveals another kind of endurance, not the immortality of individuals, but of patterns of thought that human beings pass to one another through time. The Sumerians no longer walk the earth, but the city remains. Writing remains. The idea of a state with memory remains. The longing to outlast oblivion remains. In the end, that may be what Gilgamesh was seeking in his own way. Not necessarily endless life in the body, but something that outlives a single lifespan. Cities fall, yes, but if a civilization sets one of the first stones in the long road of human history, that stone does not entirely vanish. Later, people may forget who placed it, but they are still walking on the road that began there. And so, when people ask what lesson the oldest civilization leaves us, I think the greatest lesson is not how to build a temple or how to cut a canal. It is the lesson that human beings understood very early that if they wanted to live longer than one lifetime, they needed collective memory. They needed to write, to tell, to organize, to pass things on. Without memory, there is no civilization. Without record, every achievement lives only in the fragile breath of the living and then dissolves. And if we carry that thought a little further, it reaches us as well. We too are writing, storing, telling, preserving. We too are building systems so that data, law, memory, names, and works may outlast the biology of the body. The technology has changed so much that the Sumerians could never have imagined it, but the deep impulse is the same. We are still doing what they began, resisting oblivion through order and memory. So when you hear about Sumer, do not hear it merely as the story of a distant and ancient land. Hear it as the opening chapter of our own modern story. Because there, very early, human beings first learned how to live in great cities, first gave writing the authority to carry memory beyond the self, first created institutions large enough to sustain collective life across generations. And with that, they also first tasted the cost of such a life. Conflict, inequality, the disciplining of human beings into systems, wars over resources, power clothed in sacred language. History is always like that. It does not give us a simple, heroic song. It gives us a vast mirror in which light and shadow stand side by side. I want to bring you back once more to the opening image. Morning on the low plain. Soft mud, reeds, 2 rivers, a few people trying to make that land livable. They did not know that later ages would call it the cradle of civilization. They did not know that what they were doing, digging canals, guarding storehouses, honoring gods, counting grain, building walls, would become the first steps of a journey stretching across millennia. They only knew that if they did not do these things together, they would starve or be swept away. And strangely enough, from that simple need to survive, human beings created one of the most complex things ever made: civilization. Sometimes, I think all great history begins in ordinary acts, not in grand proclamations, but in building an embankment, dividing grain, pressing the first sign into clay. From there, everything grows: village into city, temple into state, record into literature, dispute over water into organized war, the name of one city into the name of an entire civilization. That is how history grows, quietly, persistently, without announcing itself. And then, like everything else, it ages, weakens, changes shape, is inherited by others, renamed, expanded, even obscured. But the first mark does not vanish. Once the footprint is pressed into the ground, it remains there in history. If you ask me after all this, what makes Sumer so unforgettable, I would say it is not only that it is among the earliest civilizations, it is that there, for the first time, we see fairly clearly the face of civilized humanity, able to cooperate, organize, write, worship, dominate, dream, act cruelly, build, fear death, and tell stories about itself. It is a familiar face, almost painfully familiar, because it is also our face, only dressed in different language, tools, and clothing. Seen that way, the distance between us and them suddenly shortens. A Sumerian man gazing at the walls of Uruk in the evening light and thinking he lives in a great world. We stand in modern cities and think the same. A Sumerian scribe carefully recording quantities of barley, because without records the whole system might descend into disorder. We too live among immense oceans of information and create endless systems for the same reason: fear of chaos. A Sumerian king wanting his name inscribed so that future generations will remember him. Human beings still seek the same thing. At the deepest level, we remain ourselves. And because of that, the story of the oldest civilization is not simply the story of what has passed. It is a reminder that every order is built by human beings. Every order comes at a cost, and every order will one day be looked back upon as memory. The one thing that may endure the longest is perhaps not stone, but ideas powerful enough to pass from one age to another. Whenever I think of those clay tablets being unearthed after thousands of years, I feel a quiet beauty in it. Someone, 5,000 years ago, pressed a reed into clay, perhaps just to note a quantity, a delivery, an order, an offering. That person could not have known that one day, in a world unimaginably different from his own, Other human beings would hold that same tablet, brush dust from its face, and struggle to read what he had written. Between those two moments lie sand, ruin, war, generations, born and buried. And still the words remain. That is the miracle of civilization, not a supernatural miracle. The miracle that human beings learned how to place part of themselves into matter, into symbol, into story, so that the future might still touch them. And perhaps that is why I love telling stories like this, because when we retell history, we are not merely repeating what is gone. We are continuing the very work those first people began, refusing to let memory disappear. So, if you have stayed with me all the way to this point tonight, then understand that you have not simply listened to an old tale. You have traveled through a long arc from mud and river water to writing, from village to city, from ritual to law, from fear of nature to fear of being forgotten. And at the end of that journey, what remains is not only knowledge, it is a feeling for how small and how extraordinary human beings have been from the very beginning. Small, because in the end everyone dies, and time covers everything over. Extraordinary, because before time covers us over, human beings still manage to build things greater than themselves. So we have now traveled together a very long road, from the two dangerous rivers, from the first villages of the south, from Eridu, remembered as a sacred beginning, to Uruk, one of the first great cities, to the birth of writing, to rival city-states, to wars over land and water, to Gilgamesh's grief before death, to the shadow of Akkad, to crisis and collapse, to the revival of Ur III, to the fading of spoken Sumerian, into learned memory, and then onward into Babylon, Assyria, and the long shadow cast by all that first began in that land. If I had to gather all of it into a single sentence, I think I would say this: the history of the oldest civilization is the history of the first time human beings learned how to leave a mark on the world deep enough that time could not erase it completely. Thank you for staying with me until the end of the story. With long, slow historical storytelling like this, your support truly means something. If you enjoyed this style, please help support the channel by liking the video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you do not miss the next long journey into the past. And please leave a comment telling me what subject you would like to hear next in this kind of extended atmospheric format: ancient Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, Persia, Greece, Rome, or any other lost civilization you would like me to sit down and tell in this slow and steady way. And now, if the night has grown late, then I wish you a peaceful rest. And before we close, remember this beautiful truth that ancient history still whispers to us, even now. Every civilization begins with memory and only continues to live as long as someone is still willing to tell its story.